All right. We are going to continue today to toggle between the Middle Bronze, Late Bronze, and we'll end up in Iron 1, focusing all that time on the peoples that we're calling the Canaanites. The Canaanites are the folks who all sorts of historical sources from the second millennium and even earlier, BCE, attest resided in this region. The region is loosely defined in the ancient sources. It's defined essentially by cities and then areas north or south or east of the cities. So from as early as the third millennium, from Ur in southern Babylonia, modern-day Iraq, there are texts that refer to Canaan. And they refer to that area vaguely as this zone. And throughout the second millennium, sources from Egypt, Assyria, and Babylonia refer to cities in this area as Canaan. And of course, the Hebrew Bible also refers to this zone as Canaan. I use the Hebrew Bible less as a primary source because for this period, it's not a primary source. That is to say, it wasn't written in that period. It wasn't written in the second millennium, although it encodes and in some places includes verbatim pieces of texts or records that derive from that era. In order to help you out a little bit more in case the terrain is already confused, I have put another reading online for you. You don't have to read it. This is just in case you're sufficiently addled that you need something else. And that is an article by Al Leonard from Biblical Archaeologist. Biblical Archaeologist, which is now the journal Near Eastern Archaeology, has had a long-running series of articles that are called Archaeological Sources for the History of Palestine. Most of the readings that you have in your course pack for specific periods, Iron 1, Iron 2, the Hellenistic period, the Byzantine period, are part of that series. I didn't assign the Late Bronze Age article because we're not really dealing specifically with the Late Bronze Age. It's just the background for understanding Canaanite culture. But I realize that there's enough going on between Egyptian sources, Mesopotamian sources, archaeological remains from Canaan, etc., that you might want one connected reading about at least the Late Bronze Age. And so I've put Al's article on the website, and it's under Leonard 1989 because that's when he wrote it. So you can find it in the articles folder. On your timeline for the rest of today will be, as I say, toggling between Middle Bronze Age, Late Bronze Age, and Iron 1, because Canaanite culture continued in all of its essential points unchanged throughout that era, which is essentially the entirety of the second millennium BC. That is from around 1900 to around 1100 or so BC, about 800 years. The cultures of this area are that. And although the archaeological periods shift, the cultures do not. It's a little bit like looking at American history and thinking about the colonial period, the Industrial Revolution, the period between the wars. For example, you can give periods different names, but the culture is the same, and the place is the same. That's the way it is here, too. So don't get confused by these archaeological terms, which my colleagues love to make themselves sound smarter with MB2C and LB1A. Ignore that. Just think about the second millennium as one cultural continuum. In that cultural continuum of the second millennium, the zone that we're interested in here, the Levant, is like a skinny little piece of bologna in a great big sub sandwich. The two big pieces of bread on either side of the skinny little piece of bologna are Assyria and Egypt. And actually, it's more like a triple-decker, because there's also the Anatolian kingdom of the Hittites, which was located up here in modern-day Anatolia. And in the second millennium, these vast territories were largely individual imperial systems, internally united, very powerful, dealing in some ways with one another diplomatically, and in other times by warfare, to expand their turf, to expand their territory. And in all cases, the areas to which they wanted to expand were here. Because for Mesopotamia, these cities and settlements here provided fertile farmland and ports to the Mediterranean. And for the Hittite Empire here, this provided just not only another long coastline with ports, but a bulwark against the expansion of Assyria. And for Egypt, likewise, this was seen throughout its history as theirs, territory that ought to be rightfully theirs. And over the course of 2 millennia, the third and the second millennia, at various times, Egypt, in fact, politically controlled this zone. It doesn't mean it was Egyptian or Assyrian in a literal cultural sense. There were already people living there. It was just who was in charge of them that shifted throughout that time. Ooh. Okay, so we ended last time looking briefly at the site of Lachish, and I point out, and I want to tell you that a little bit before the end of class today, inshallah, we will get to a question that I'm going to ask you, which is, what are the characteristics of Canaanite culture? The characteristics are going to be bits and pieces that you've absorbed from looking at the images, the remains from last lecture and also today. So when you're looking at these slides and you're taking notes, think, what are the constituent elements of this world? So here's one of them, large cities. This is a zone that's fought over by even larger political units, but what they're fighting over are themselves large settled territories. And one of those large cities is Lachish. And as I remind you, this huge mound is a construction of the Middle Bronze Age. That's when it was built up like that. And these large cities had religious edifices, more than one in them. And you remember last time that we looked at this one, the Fassi Temple, the temple that was built inside the abandoned moat. The Fassi Temple was actually built originally in the late Bronze Age. There were earlier temples at Lachish from the Middle Bronze Age that also continued into the late Bronze Age. The reason that we looked specifically at the Fassi Temple is because it was in the ruins of that temple that this extraordinary object was discovered, the Lachish ewer, E-W-E-R. The Lachish ewer is a little jug with heraldic animals painted on it, and an inscription. And the inscription is one that tells us that the language is Semitic, the names are Semitic, that is the language family that they belong to. The script is alphabetic. It's an alphabetic script. And there are deities cited in this script. And in this case, the deity cited is Elat, the female consort of the storm god El, who we're about to meet himself in just a moment. This script is an invention, almost certainly, of Canaanites. And the place where they were inspired to invent it was Egypt. And the circumstances in which they were inspired to invent it was while they were working for Egyptians. And the evidence is here at this site, Sarabat al-Qadim in the Sinai Peninsula, right about there, near the coast of southern Sinai, at Sarabat al-Qadim, beginning in Egyptian Middle Kingdom time, so around 1900 BCE, 12th dynasty. There were mining operations because here at Sarabat al-Qadim are turquoise mines, mines in which you can go and extract turquoise, which is very lovely and used frequently in Egyptian jewelry, very prized, very coveted item. And in the area of the turquoise mines, there was a temple dedicated to the Egyptian deity Hathor. And you see some of the decorative stelae of the temple here. The Egyptian deity Hathor is one that is of some interest to us because we'll be seeing her face at some Canaanite sites shortly. So I show you her better preserved visage from other sites in Egypt. There are preserved stelae with Hathor representations at Sarabat al-Qadim, but they're not nearly as photogenic as these. And so I show you these so that you get a good sense of what Hathor looks like. And she's very recognizable. She looks the same every time she shows up. Very handy for those of us wanting to recognize her. She has this weird artificial, I don't know, early 1960s pigtail style. And an unusually broad face and ears that should remind you of a cow, because in fact her animal manifestation is a cow. And she sometimes, you might not think of that as an attractive alter ego for a female deity, but there you go. You're not an ancient Egyptian, so probably you can't relate to that, but that's how Hathor always looks, and she has this very particular hairstyle, always tucked behind her ears so that you can make sure that she's really Hathor. All right, so Hathor is the deity at Sarabat al-Qadim. There are a series of mines, and there are scratched onto the walls at the mines about 25 inscriptions. 11 of them are collected in front of one mine, mine L, and you're looking at one of those inscriptions here. How do we know that these are not Egyptians, but they're affected by Egyptians? Because the letters here, or the scratches here, are derived from Egyptian hieroglyphic signs. That's where the actual signs come from. So this sign, for example, which is this sign, and I apologize for this, but I can't, on my typewriter, make a backwards apostrophe. So there are actually two different signages in the Canaanite and the Hebrew and the Phoenician, all these Semitic alphabets, Ugaritic, you name it. And one is an apostrophe, this is an ayin and this is an aleph. And the aleph, the apostrophe, goes the other way. But I can't make my font do that. So this is an aleph. You just have to turn around. Anyway, this sign is actually part of the Egyptian hieroglyphic roster of signs, as is this, as is this, as is all of them. But in Egyptian, they're syllabic signs, and they work differently. In what's happened here is that these signages have been adopted by the workers here as simple phonemes, just a sound, not a syllable, just an individual sound. And the sounds are all consonantal. So it's an alphabet with only consonants. There are no vowels. If you want vowels, you have to wait for the Greeks. The Greeks add the vowels to the alphabet after they borrow it from these folks. So these consonantal signs are used to spell out words and names. And here, for example, they are spelling out le, that's a lamed, that hook there, which is the preposition that means to. And then the signs go down here, and it's aleph, lamed, you can't really see the lamed, ale, o, lam, ayin, lamed, mem. Ayin, lamed, mem. There's ayin, lamed, mem. Ale, olam, ale, the male equivalent of elat, the deity whom you recently met on the Lachish ewer. El is a deity that we know from second millennium texts in large cities in the northern part of the region of the Levant, cities that are now in modern-day Lebanon and southern Syria, Ugarit, Byblos. There are texts from those cities, and in those texts there are a whole series of deities mentioned, and the main deity is El. This El is a deity who we'll come to recognize when we get down to the Israelites, whose name Yisrael encodes it. Yisrael is a name that includes the deity El. El Olam is a term, God of the heavens, God of the skies, that appears in Genesis, along with other second millennium texts. El, in other words, is a deity, the chief deity, the creator deity, the builder deity, the master deity, the Zeus of the Semitic Levantine pantheon of the second millennium, the big guy. He is a deity of the area of Canaan. And therefore, historians believe these signs were inscribed in these mines by Canaanite workers working for Egyptians, mining turquoise in the middle of the second millennium at Sarabat al-Qadim. And in conjunction with their Egyptian masters, they picked up the know-how to write, but simplified the technology so that anybody could do it, not just a scribe trained over many, many years. And if anybody has tried to learn hieroglyphs here, you realize immediately that the alphabet is a good invention, much more streamlined than hieroglyphs, much more democratic, easier for anybody to pick up. And it is that alphabet which is on the Lachish ewer. So here is the Aleph and the Lamed and the Taf, right down there, Elat. Throughout the second millennium, on and off, this region of the Levant, as I say, came in and out of the control of Egypt, the political control of Egypt. And the high point of Egyptian control over this territory occurred in the period of time that archaeologists call the Late Bronze Age. So the latter part of the 15th, the 14th, and the early 13th centuries BC. And that is a period that some of you may have learned about from other classes it's sometimes called the Amarna period. And you're looking here at two of the documents that give their name to this period. The city of Amarna was the capital of the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten. Akhenaten was the Egyptian pharaoh who declared the rule of the sun as being the single source of power above, and moved the capital of Egypt to a new city, which was called Akhetaten, or in its modern Egyptian incarnation, Tel el Amarna. And at Tel el Amarna in the 19th century, a hoard of over 300 cuneiform documents were found, and you're looking at a couple of them here. And a huge quantity of those documents are letters from kings of cities in Canaan to the Egyptian pharaoh. And in these letters, we see several things. One is that the people who write the letters are really in charge of their city and the territory around their city. So you can imagine this zone as a whole series of almost little city-states, or what we would think of today as major metropolitan areas. One central downtown, that would be the great big Tel, the main city, but then the agricultural hinterland that supports it. So the city of Minneapolis-St. Paul would probably extend to around St. Cloud, say. And underlined here are just some of the cities from which letters from the people in charge here were sent to the Egyptian pharaoh. One of the other things that we can tell is that these guys knew their place. They knew where they ranked in the great scheme of things, because these pharaohs, the pharaoh Akhenaten, received these letters, and they start in frequently with the king naming himself and then saying, I, for example, Rib Ada Biblos, am your servant and the dust of your feet. So, in other words, they are client kings. They are subordinate. They are not the equivalent of the pharaoh. They are lesser political entities in this larger system. Let me go back for a second. The bulk of the letters from kings in Canaan come from cities from the line between ancient and modern Akko through the Jezreel Valley to the city of Bet-Shan, which is here at the far end of the Jezreel Valley, and then south. There are a couple letters from the king of Hatzor up here. We'll be getting to Hatzor in a minute. And then letters from kings up and down the modern-day Lebanese coast. But it's clear that Egyptian hegemony in this period in the area of Canaan extended up to the area of the Jezreel Valley and not north of it. North of it was territory that those kings had more to do with Assyria and the Hittite territory. Upheavals, weaknesses, political instability in Egypt meant that periodically the kings here saw a chance to break free, to break loose of the yoke of subordination under the political subordination that they lived, and periodically did that. And as a consequence, we have remains from the late Bronze Age, from a lot of these major cities, of Egyptian corrective attempts to reel everybody back in. So here you're looking at an aerial view of the Bet-Shan Valley, which is the eastern end of the Jezreel Valley. And this large mound here is Tel Rehov, one of the sites there. And at the far end of this valley is the site of Bet-Shan itself. And you see here this huge tell. There's a classical city here in the plain, and in about April we'll be getting to that classical city. But in the Bronze Age, the settlement was confined to the very top of the tell. And up here on the top of the tell, archaeologists from the University of Pennsylvania in the 1930s excavated a series of actual Egyptian, both in style and in the deity to whom they were consecrated, temples. And you see here one of those temples. There were, as I say, an entire series. This one happens to be the temple of the Egyptian pharaoh Seti I, who ruled at the beginning of the 13th century BC. He's a couple of kings after the end of the Amarna period. The Amarna period essentially ends with the pharaoh Tutankhamun, who I think most people have heard of, so that might help fix the chronology, or at least the personalities in your head. And Akhenaten's wife was Nefertiti, she of the beautiful bust in Berlin that now the Egyptian Department of Antiquities wants back. And that will be very interesting to see if they can get it back. The Pergamon Museum in Berlin has got their heels dug in pretty firmly. So in the chaos that ensued after Akhenaten died young, was succeeded by the boy king Tutankhamun, who then, of course, also died young, allowing Howard Carter to find all the goodies in his tomb a little over 100 years ago. Many of the cities, as I say, in Canaan, apparently banded together in revolt, and Seti the first was an Egyptian pharaoh who campaigned in Israel and attempted to reassert his hegemony. And a big victory stele with the pharaoh standing before Horus with the sun disk and the crown on his head was found at Bet Shan. You can imagine the assertive political effect of this huge stone stele and this great big temple on the top of this large mound, anchoring and proclaiming Egyptian control over this territory. Let's look at now in detail two sites whose remains we have a lot of information by excavation from the Late Bronze Age and Iron I to see what Canaanite culture in this period actually looked like. So here's the site of Megiddo. Megiddo in the Jezreel Valley, right at the area of the pass down to the coastal plain, about halfway between Akko and Bet Shan. If you don't have Bet Shan on your map, you should put Bet Shan on your map. I will give you all a chance to do that. So that aerial view that I showed you was this widening valley here, the eastern end of the Jezreel. Bet Shan? Okay. These large sites that we're going to start to talk about, and Megiddo will not be the only example of this, are excavated in pieces, and then archaeologists reconstruct across the area of the site what it looked like at a certain point in time. And those reconstructions are called strata. And within a stratum, stratus plural, within a stratum, there will be evidence for the architecture, the associated finds. You'll evince what the character of the site was, if it was fortified, if there's a monumental gate, if there's public architecture, what the private architecture is like, if there's religious architecture. And, importantly, information about its date. Now, in the case of the Bronze Age and the early part of the Iron Age, well, actually, the later part of the Iron Age, too, the way we get information about dates is when we have finds that document kings from other places, like Egypt or Assyria, because those kings come with more or less absolute dates. We know through a series of long historical records and equations with other historical events in the classical world, and even astronomical events, the specific dates. So when we find objects of those other datable people in these various strata, we can then assign dates to the levels. So at Megiddo, which was largely excavated, there's excavations still going on, and if anybody wants to go there, they're digging this summer. But the major part of the excavations were by the University of Chicago in the 1930s. Not wonderful time to have a large-scale archaeological excavation, but they were funded by John Rockefeller, so that was okay. And there are up to 22 strata at Megiddo. The lowest, the 22nd, is early Bronze Age, the beginning of the 3rd millennium. Stratum 7b, so you're looking here at an aerial of the top of the mound and then a reconstruction of this stratum. Stratum 7b is towards the end of the Late Bronze Age, 13th century. That is to say, the period essentially of Seti I and the deployment of Egyptian control over this zone. This Canaanite city has a domestic area, very small homes, haphazardly arranged. A religious area, a temple, inside an enclosure wall. And because the temple is inside a kind of fortified wall, this temple is usually called, at Megiddo, the Migdal Temple, which means fortified temple. Migdal is M-I-G-D-A-L, Migdal. The Migdal Temple, which as you can see is a large, open, one large open room with a sort of guarded area entering it, and a single entrance going in. And a palatial compound entered by a many-chambered gate. So you still enter the area of Megiddo today, up this part of the mound, through this gate, and then to the north of the gate, a huge administrative compound with a large courtyard and rooms around it, and subsidiary buildings. And, of course, everything that's in solid black, the excavators actually found, and then everything else has been reconstructed by usually analogy or inference from what was actually found above it. So you have a big city with zones of occupation, administrative, religious, and domestic. And this large gateway and monumental entranceway ought to remind you of monumental entranceways to other Canaanite cities that we looked at last time, Ashkelon and Dan, whose huge Middle Bronze Age mud brick gates marked impressive entryways, fortified entryways to their cities. Towards the end of the 13th century, things had again gotten, apparently, according to the Egyptians, a little out of control in Canaan. These people were very problematic, these Canaanites. They kept rebelling, and they had to keep being subdued. And towards the end of the 13th century, the pharaoh Merneptah, who ruled for a decade towards the end of the 13th century, 1212 to 1202, took it upon himself to reacquaint the Canaanites with who was boss, and it was, as you see here in this completely objective depiction of Merneptah on a wall from one of his temples, it was he, easily recognized because he's 3 times larger than everybody else. And we have 2 records of Merneptah's activities in Canaan at this time. And in both of them, a number of cities, 3 cities specifically, are mentioned as having been clobbered, conquered. One is Ashkelon, one is Gezer, and one is Megiddo. I just point out to you, and I will have a chance to point out to you again, 2 lectures from now, the character of this route. If you compare this, if you would lay this over your map, you would see that what Merneptah does is come, from, actually probably lands in Gaza, comes up the southern coastal plain, traverses through the Shvelah, and then arcs around the central hills, going up the northern coastal plain, and then through the pass to Megiddo, and then down through the Jezreel Valley to Bet Shan. So this is a very topographically efficient route that Merneptah takes. And one of the 2 representations of his campaign occurs on a wall at this site, which is Karnak in Upper Egypt. And at Karnak, this marvelous flanking row of sphinxes set up outside the great temple of Ammon at Karnak. Inside the temple complex, there are a series of huge walls with sculptures on them, and one of them is here. This slide is very difficult to make out any detail. You might see a huge striding Merneptah right here, arm raised, not in friendship. Here's his head, torso, striding legs. And here, in front of this striding Merneptah, is a relief. There are, in fact, 4 panels on this wall. It's called the Cour de la Cachette because it's the wall of the caches, because there were a lot of sculptures and tablets found in the court right in front of this wall. And on the wall of the Cour de la Cachette are 4 reliefs. And 3 of the reliefs depict the conquest of those 3 cities, Ashkelon and Gezer. Actually, the third city that they depict isn't the reliefs depict isn't Megiddo. It's another city that's in the list called Yanoam, which we're not exactly sure where it is. But the best preserved of them is the relief of Ashkelon. What we can see of the relief of Gezer looks like this, and you see a huge striding pharaoh, a huge striding Merneptah. Here you can just make out. You can see his horses must have been here because here are their front hooves. Galloping forward, and it says it identifies the cities in the hieroglyphs, so there's not any doubt about who's who. And so Ashkelon is identified in the hieroglyphs here, which I cannot read hieroglyphs, so I cannot pick out for you which one is Ashkelon. And here you can see the city of Ashkelon itself. Here's the city of Ashkelon. There's a big hill in front with the Egyptian archers, and there are large gates and walls, and on the top of the fortified walls, you see the Canaanite inhabitants, some of them trying to let people out the back way. So here's somebody letting somebody out the back side of the walls. Other people have their hands up, perhaps praying, perhaps in surrender. Here may be a priest holding some incense or some offering that's flaming. And the people have specific physiognomies. They have long hair. They have beards. They have, it's a little hard to see in this kind of messy slide, but they have prominent noses. They are distinct physiognomically from the Egyptians. So here, we won't count Merneptah, who you may fairly believe is an idealized depiction, but you can see the Egyptian archers, and they have shorter hair, no beards, a different profile of their face. So in other words, the Canaanites are recognizable. The Canaanites are distinct. They're identifiable. They live in a large fortified city, and of course they are losing the battle in this depiction. It's possible, it's not absolutely definite, that the destruction of Stratum 7b, and Stratum 7b was in fact thoroughly destroyed at Megiddo. We're back at Megiddo now. Sorry about ratcheting around. It's possible that the destruction of Stratum 7b was by Merneptah. It's not absolutely necessary because there's a fair amount going on in this period, and there could be some unknown Hittite incursion. But anyway, after the 13th century and the end of Stratum 7b, let's say it was Merneptah. The city that arose on top of Stratum 7b, which is helpfully called Stratum 7a, the 12th century city, is almost identical. In other words, we can assume from this that nothing happened severely to the people who lived here, or enough of them remained that they simply reconstructed the city that they had. So here's the same sort of addled domestic area, the same gate formation and administrative complex. There is a little difference now in that there's a new structure here, a sort of series of storerooms, but essentially, obviously, same large courtyard, rooms around it, and most importantly, the same temple. Now this time, the Migdal temple probably shouldn't be called a Migdal temple anymore because it's no longer fortified. The fortification wall is gone from around it. But the form of the temple is the same, the placement of the temple is the same, and there's every reason to believe that the deity honored in the temple was the same. So we assume, therefore, that the people were the same. In that temple, from stratum 7a, a representation of that deity was found. And you're looking at him here. He's currently in the collection of the University of Chicago Oriental Institute. Anybody wants to visit there, you can see him in the Palestine galleries. From the site of Megiddo, this is a bronze statuette sheathed in gold leaf, found by the Chicago excavators here in this temple. Those were the days of excavating. We don't find stuff like that anymore. Man, all those early archaeologists got everything good. So you see a seated male deity. He has a short beard. He has a weird sort of cone cap. He is enthroned. And he is generally identified as El. That is, that main deity, the same one to whom the Canaanites scratched their prayers on the inside entrances of the mines at Sarabat el-Qadim. The same deity who is referred to in other second millennium texts from the Levant. From that cellar room of stratum 7a, an incredible hoard of over 300 carved ivories was recovered. The carved ivories are amazing. Ivory is not some sort of native thing to this zone. This ivory is almost all elephant tusk. And there are no elephants here. The ivories by style exhibit references to both Assyria and Egypt and also other cities on the Levantine coast. And it's likely that they arrived at Megiddo already carved. That is, that there was not a workshop here at Megiddo, but that this is a kind of cache, probably of gifts given to the king of Megiddo. There must still be some sort of a king because we still have some sort of a palace. So you see here a striding lady. She has a glass eye. This is incredible. She's an inlay, almost certainly an inlay. These were pieces of, you can imagine, furniture, beds, chairs, beds, tables, boxes with inlays of ivory figures. So you see two of them here, and here are some more. This is an Egyptian dwarf deity called Bes, B-E-S. Bes has wings and a strange animal head, animal ear, but human body. A sphinx, lactating, a lactating sphinx. I love her. This, which is actually considerably bigger than the two. These are both inlays, and you can see the little slots for inlays, so they would have been part of the formwork, perhaps, of a piece of furniture, a bed or a chair. But this is actually about twice as big as either of the inlays, and it's a game board. It's a kind of game that was called the game of 58 holes. And it's a game that was invented in Mesopotamia in the 3rd millennium, adopted eagerly by the Egyptians in the latter part of the 3rd millennium, and I guess played by people who lived at Megiddo, because here's the board. The closest I can think of as an equivalent is Chinese checkers. And that might not seem like the world's most exciting thing to you, but back in the day, this is what passed for it. This winged griffin, very formidable winged griffin, is the box top, a top of a box, an ivory box. So this is an Egyptian deity. This is an Assyrian confection of eagle's wings, lions, lower part and a hawk or some kind of, I don't know, pterodactyl-like. I guess they didn't have pterodactyls. Yeah.
Is there any correlation between the shape of the board game and, like, the figure of eight shield?
Well, it has been noticed that the board game is in the shape of a Mycenaean figure of eight shield. And this is usually commented upon, although what one could then make of that, and if it's actually a meaningful relationship or this was just the best shape for the game, since nobody knows how to play the game, it's an open question. But all publications of this actually do say that, suggesting that people would dearly love to make some connection there, but haven't quite been able to manage it yet. Probably the most amazing discovery in the ivory cache, and you could have an entire lecture about it, over 300 objects, all incredible, is this, which is a knife, the placket of a knife handle, and it would have been attached with rivets to the blade. So it was sort of a sheath that would have rendered the blade unusable, but even more ceremonial. And so you see the holes for the rivets. And there is a procession of nude men, uncircumcised nude men, being obviously prisoners. They're bound. Their hands are bound. I mean, you might assume they were prisoners just by the fact that they were naked, but just to drive the point home, they're tied up. Some army commander or general in a chariot is striding along. They are walking behind another soldier-like official holding a small round shield and a musician playing a lyre. And they advance to a personage seated on an enormous throne whose sides are decorated with sphinxes like this one, although not lactating. And then there are a few servants behind the throne with a large jar and some doggies poking out of the jar, and a bird flying off, perhaps an augury, hard to say. Very mysterious scene, but tells us that here at Megiddo was the concept of royalty, perhaps semi-divine, hard to say. An army, musicians, court, in other words, court pageantry. And the physiognomy of these prisoners is identical to the physiognomy of the people leading them. In other words, these are the same people fighting each other. Same people from the point of view of whoever made this. Obviously, they didn't think of themselves as the same people. People from different cities might have thought of themselves as different. But to an outsider looking in, they're the same. Bearded, same nose. Their hair is all bound up, so you can't tell that they have long hair, but otherwise identical.
Have you said a name just for reference?
It's part of the Megiddo ivory cache. Yeah, I would love to give you some handy, like we had the name of the Lachish ewer, right? That was handy. This doesn't have a handy sort of name. It's the carved ivory knife from Megiddo. That's not a good name. I just made that up. But you can call it that. I'll know what you mean. You can see that the physiognomy of the people on the knife carving is the same as the people in the reliefs at the Cour de la Cachette. In other words, these are Canaanites. Okay. Stratum 12 is destroyed. This is how you get from stratum to stratum at Megiddo. Major destruction, big fire, lots of ash, buildings, walls toppled in. Sometime in the 12th century, the latest datable material in the stratum is an ivory pen box with a cartouche of Ramses VI, who was pharaoh in the middle of the 12th century, around from 1150 something to 1143. That's the latest item in the level, which means that people were still living here and using it in the middle of the 12th century. But at some point after the middle of the 12th century, the stratum is destroyed, and a new level is built on top. This level has some significant differences, but also important similarities with the level that went before. So again, there is a domestic area. Again, there is a palatial area, although the palatial area, or administrative area, but it's much, much smaller, and it's not fortified. There's no big gate. No big gateway anymore. No monumental gateway. So you could assume that whoever is in charge here isn't as powerful, doesn't perhaps have as many people to hand to build things up, but they are likely the same people, and the reason that they're likely the same people is because the temple is still there. If they aren't the same people, they believe the same things, whoever they are. So in effect, you can relate them. Because the Migdal temple, again, still unfortified, as it was in the previous stratum 7a, the 11th century temple is still intact. And in the area of that temple, this amazing jug was found, and you'll be happy to know that it has an actual name, so it's easy to refer to. And it's the Orpheus jug, and it's called the Orpheus jug completely wrongly. I mean, there was no Orpheus back then. The Orpheus, a guy from Greek myth, 1,000 years later. But it's called the Orpheus jug because there is a very sketchily drawn man, and he's wearing a big breastplate or carrying a shield. And he's painted in dark on light and silhouette, so there are no internal designations, but you can see his profile here. And he's holding a lyre, just like the character on the knife handle, the ivory knife handle. And striding before him and all the way around, in fact, this is the only human figure, because all the rest of the decoration around are animals. Very weirdly drawn, not to normal, the way they look, animals. This is some sort of a goat-like thing with legs that are way too short and a body that is way too long, but and a neck that is way too high, but anyway, some sort of sheep-like, goat-like, deer-like quadruped. And they're all like that. And so you have a person playing music and animals following, hence the designation Orpheus, because Orpheus in Greek myth was somebody who could play music and charm and calm and lead animals. And the style of this is evocative of the Lachish ewer. Animals, dark on light, and the ceremonial sense that one receives from this, from the jug. The Orpheus jug is 11th century. The Lachish jug, or the Lachish ewer, is 14th or 13th century. So this is a couple hundred years earlier than this. But the discovery of this in Megiddo stratum 6a, the 11th century stratum, suggests that this culture is still present at Megiddo. All right. So we've been, where's Megiddo? Right there. So we've been here at Megiddo looking at essentially Canaanite culture through this area of Egyptian domination, attack, control, destruction, etc. And now we're going to go up and look at Hatzor, a city which is more in the orbit of Assyria than it is of Egypt, the dividing line being between those two great powers in this period being right about there. So here's Hatzor. In aerial view, this enormous mound, like Lachish, like Dan, like Ashkelon, like Megiddo, a great big city. And with an upper citadel of about 30 acres, and a lower town of about 170 acres. This vast lower area and the upper area were first excavated by Yigal Yadin, great Israeli archaeologist, beginning in the 1950s, and since the early 90s, excavations have been started again there by Hebrew University under Amnon Bentor. This is another site you can go work at this summer if you want to, Hatzor, terrific excavation. All right, so you're looking here at an aerial view of the citadel. Both Yadin and then later Bentor, the excavator who succeeded Yadin, have focused their attention on this area of the citadel, so-called Area A, underneath this now very nice modern roof. These are pictures before they put the roof up. I'm very happy I got these before they put the roof up because can't get good pictures anymore now that the roof is up, although it's all much better preserved. Is a huge temple. A huge temple. If you go looking around on the internet for information about Hatzor, you almost certainly will discover references to this as a palace, because for the last 15 years, that's what the excavators have been calling it. They only changed their minds about a year ago about it, for very good reason. And now that they've said it, we're all like, oh yeah, right, of course, it's a temple, not a palace. But so be careful about what you might read about it. And in fact, I think if Larry Hurt talks about this or Liz and Beth talk about this in their Iron 1 article, they probably call it a palace. But it's not. It's a temple. Okay. So there's this great big temple, huge courtyard on top, big columns, big basalt column bases here. Black basalt orthostats lining mud brick walls. This big forecourt, which was about 40 feet square. You see it here. So very large, very impressive. And you see a reconstruction drawing here of people walking up. There are these were the basalt column bases. You have to imagine gigantic columns. A large single cella entered on the short side, just like the Migdal temple at Megiddo. Same, more or less same size, same design. And inside it were found this bronze bull, this basalt seated statue, and actually also some cuneiform tablets, among lots of other goodies. Here's one of the cuneiform tablets that was found. Cuneiform tablets of diplomatic correspondence with the kings of Assyria. Also, ivories were found in this area, including this ivory box lid and this ivory spoon. This is a spoon, and this is the top of the handle of the spoon, and you should recognize her. Who's this? Hathor. Yes, that's right. There she is. Recognizable. Here she is, incised, and her Hathorness is being celebrated or something by these two figures on either side of her in their nice little outfits. Their little kilts. Okay, so a large temple on the top of the citadel. And then in the area between the citadel and the lower city, the sort of slope going down to the lower city, so-called Area M, it was found this amazing discovery, a paved platform with the base of what is likely a large chair or a throne. This was originally a single basalt slab. It was broken up in a big fire, which we're going to hear about 2 times from now. So just don't imagine those cracks there anymore. But there are 4 evenly spaced depressions, like for the legs of a very sturdy chair, on the top of this. And it's, it would be 2 tons, I think. Yeah, 2 tons. Single basalt slab, 2 tons. So incredible. So this throne, you can recollect that ivory knife handle from Megiddo and that big Sphinx throne, somebody sitting on that. You can imagine this as an intermediate stop for somebody coming from the lower city up to the citadel, the upper city, and confronting some very impressive, perhaps semi-divinized king holding court here. Down in the lower city, so here in this aerial view, this is the area of the lower city, now all built over, but had been excavated in parts by Yadin. A number of other small shrines were uncovered. Here in Area H, you see the so-called orthostat shrine. Here's a single entrance on the long side, and a series of basalt carvings and altars, here's one, were found inside. These temples, like the temple on the top of the citadel, were first built in the Middle Bronze Age and continued to be used, cleaned out, kept up through the Late Bronze Age. So it through into the second millennium. Another one of these temples in the lower city, there were a bunch of them, so it's a very open society in terms of religious practice and deities, is this shrine, this room. Here in Area C, there's the entrance, and in a kind of alcove in the back wall were found this whole series of basalt standing stones, one of which had 2 hands raised toward a lunar disk, a mask, perhaps something used in cult, and the top of a sort of scepter with snakes on it. This little scepter is similar to the item that's held in the hand of the enthroned deity Ale found at Megiddo. So a raft of cult objects. Now, take a few minutes. This will not be the first time I do this in class, and for any of you that have ever had a class with me before, you know this drill. Talk to the person or people near you, next to you, around you. That is, just chat away. And come up with as many aspects of Canaanite culture as you can. Anything from MB, LB, or Iron 1 that you've seen from class last time or today. Make a list.
We want to hear talking.
Talk, talk, talk.
You just want to talk to me after.
Hmm?
Just want to talk to me after class.
No, I don't think we need to. What do we need to talk about?
Well, I don't know. You mentioned in an email earlier that you wanted to meet with me about after the first class to just talk about the expectations, but it seems like it's pretty straightforward. So.
I think it's pretty straightforward.
Yeah. Okay.
The only thing I would say to you is, look at this, and if you think you need something else to read, let me know.
Yeah. Actually, a lot of the stuff is stuff that we covered in the class I took with Ava.
Very good.
So I am relatively familiar with it.
Excellent.
Not some of those blue ivories, though.
That's great. I know. They're awesome.
I'm probably gonna try and give a practice talk.
Oh, that's good.
Presentation. I'm giving in Michigan in a week or so. So I'll let you know when I schedule the time.
When's that conference going to be?
The conference is February 7th, I believe.
Excellent.
It's coming up. I'm in the process of cutting my 25-page paper down to a 15-minute talk.
Good luck.
A ton of fun.
Right, exactly. Okay, how many things do you guys have so far? Oh, you need more. How many do you have so far? Oh, you have a long list.
Wait, no, we just have this.
Oh, you need more, you need more. How many do you have so far? More. You need more. I agree. It's not an aspect of their culture.
But could they be an aspect of their culture because the way they're depicted like that is all from like Egyptian or Syrian like sources? So it's not like they're slaves, but like they're just like they love like the Egyptians belong to one group.
Well, I mean, to the extent that it's a choice, it's culture. To the extent that it's so that a beard, that could be culture. How the profile of their nose, no.
Well, I mean, just like the way that the Egyptians depict them all like that.
But we're looking at their culture from the inside, not from the outside. That's the beauty of archaeology. Oh, yeah.
Obviously, they were very
How
religious
organized
people.
what?
Like their priesthoods were.
Well,
We know anything about that?
no. We don't. We know that they existed, but we don't know how they worked.
Very interesting.
Yes.
Like to know more about
Yes. Well, if you want to know more about that, you need to study Ugarit. Ugarit is the city where we have information about that. We have actual texts.
that. Help us to understand Hebrew quite a bit.
That's right. Yes, indeed.
Are we going to talk about Garrett?
No, sadly not. If we were doing Middle Bronze, Late Bronze, we would. For that, you need to take Professor Van Dassau's Ancient Near Eastern History class this semester, but at other times. Okay, let's have a little group conversation here. All right, tell me something, somebody. Large cities. Large cities, in fact, very large. There have been surveys, surface surveys, throughout the area. Let's see, I wrote this statistic down here someplace. But where? Oh, yeah. Large cities take up 49% of all the sites found are large cities. 49% of all the sites found. 36% are medium-size sites, like towns, and 16% are small sites. So about half of the settlements of Canaan in the second millennium are large cities. About half. And that is a very well-integrated urban-rural network. The large cities are evenly dispersed around the territory. Yes, absolutely. This is the whole. Remember last time when we started out and talking about the fertility of the Galilee, the Jezreel, the coastal plain, the rainfall isohyet. This is agriculturally very dependable. There's a very interesting excerpt in I don't remember now exactly which book it is in the Hebrew Bible, I guess it's probably Exodus, when Egypt is being compared with Canaan. Canaan is considered just amazing because you don't have to do any work to get the water. It just comes. You don't have to depend on the river. You don't have to depend on irrigation. It's faithful and it's reliable, and it's enough. So yes, that's exactly right. And the point of that well-integrated site size is this was a well-connected network where these smaller sites and villages lived within the parameters of large cities and supported them, and stuff went back and forth. Something else? Somebody? And religion is important, and what about that religion? Who are the deities? Ale? Yeah, maybe. We don't actually find any temples to Hathor. A lot. So there's a pantheon. There's a male and a female deity. What else?
Same basic design where they've got the primary room for the most part, and some storerooms or whatever, great benches.
There are a lot of temples, some of them like Acropolis temples. The one at Megiddo, the one at Hatzor, are these large rooms, single rooms, main entrance on the short side, heavy walled. But then there are also other sorts of temples, too. Like there's the Fosse Temple, there's the Orthostat Temple, and the small shrine at Hatzor. So there's a variety, but there is one main kind of sort of city temple on the top, absolutely. That was a tiny little ivory box lid with a depiction of Hathor on it. So Hathor there has been reduced to decoration. You know, as opposed to a gigantic stone column with Hathor at the top of it, like on a temple of Hathor at Sarepta, Kudim, or Dendera, or any one of the Egyptian temples. Something else? Yes, well fortified, so must have been a large cohort of people and very intelligent defensive architecture. Gates, arcaded gates. Maybe. We don't really know what the status was of the people in those villages. That would be an assumption that they were not free and easy. But there is clearly a political subordination of everybody in this area to a system, an imperial system even larger than themselves. But internally in Canaan, well, there are kings. It's true that we have the Megiddo knife with the procession of prisoners. Whether those people then turn out to be slaves or captives or servants, that we would like to know, but we don't. Well, they have defensive walls. They're not anything like as much destruction as you would. I mean, it's sort of like ICBMs. You have a lot of things so that people don't attack you. You have a lot of defensive fortifications to scare people away. We don't have. It's true that sometimes in some places there are destruction levels, but and so there's that mentality. How much that is translated into reality. What about objects like this or this? Educated. Connections with other places. Connections with Egypt. Connections with Assyria. Egypt, Assyria. Luxury goods. Pretty wealthy. What about this? Who are these? What is this? Yeah, I mean, what is it for the people of Canaan? It's a symbol of a deity. It's a symbol of a deity. Deities manifested as animals, generally bovine. Monumental defense, urban, multiple temples and shrines, deities with animal manifestations, male and female deities, alphabetic writing, international political connections, priestly or royal authority, not in the same league importance-wise, but as a point, dark on light decorated pottery. Okay, this is a view of Canaanite culture, the culture that is there in place in this territory when Moses or somebody is standing on Nebo and when other peoples are beginning to move around in the Mediterranean too, besides those purported Israelites, and we will meet up with them next time.